we'll get started. All right, so hi everyone. Welcome to Webinar Wednesday. I think most of you have been here before, but just so you know, this recording will be posted onto the website probably sometime tomorrow. And then there will be a CEU request as well on that same link. We have Emily Kringle with us today. She's a rehab scientist with a clinical background in occupational therapy. She is a postdoctoral fellow in the Division of Academic Internal Medicine and Geriatrics at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Her research focuses on health promotion among underserved populations with stroke. She also explores the influence of social and contextual factors on post-stroke sedentary behavior and engagement in meaningful daily activities. So I will turn it over to you, Emily. Thanks for coming.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Carly, for inviting me, and also to the North Dakota Brain Injury Network for inviting me to join you this afternoon. Like Carly said, I'm an occupational therapist and a rehabilitation scientist. I have sort of North Dakota roots. I did my occupational therapy degree at UND and graduated from there. And then after practicing for a few years, I did pursue research and moved to the University of Pittsburgh, where I completed my PhD, and that brought me here to Chicago. And my research focuses broadly on rehab interventions to help people with stroke return to physically active lifestyles, and specifically to reduce the amount of time that they spend in sedentary behavior. And so this afternoon, we're going to kind of walk through different ways that we can talk about physical activity and sedentary behavior, different ways that those terms are used in some of the literature that we read, some of the evidence for how stroke affects physical activity and active lifestyles. And then we'll also move into discussing a little bit about an intervention that I'm in the process of developing that uses engaging in meaningful daily activities for the purpose of reducing post-stroke sedentary behavior. So we will have some time at the end for discussion and questions. And if you do have questions along the way, please feel free to type them into the chat, or at the end, you'll have an opportunity to unmute yourself and ask the question. Carly is going to help me monitor the chat. I have a little bit of difficulty multitasking with the Zoom and sharing the screen and all of that. And so she'll interrupt me if it's a question that seems urgent for the moment. Otherwise, she'll probably hold most of the questions until the end. So first of all, why are we concerned with physical activity after stroke? We know that stroke instigates a vicious cycle that leads to impairments, specifically mobility, motor, cognition, mood impairments that are associated with low levels of physical activity. And these low levels of physical activity can compromise the medical management of comorbid chronic health conditions like hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, and depression. And these can elevate the risk for recurrent stroke, which just continues that cycle. Interventions that aim to improve stroke survivors' physical activity levels can disrupt this cycle and improve long-term health outcomes for people with stroke. When we look at the literature, at what's out there as far as what interventions or approaches are effective for helping people with stroke to become more physically active, we find that researchers who are developing these interventions have kind of described and conceptualized and thought about and measured physical activity in many different ways. And so many times these interventions are focusing on adherence to a specific type of physical activity. So some of the ways that or some of the ways that physical activity is discussed in the literature focus on different intensities of physical activity. So MVPA stands for moderate to vigorous physical activity, is an example of this kind of intensity approach to measuring physical activity. And within this, there's a specific kind of type of MVPA that many of us know as exercise. When I think about exercise, I think about going to the gym, working out, any type of physical activity that is structured, that is repetitive, and that's done for the specific purpose of improving my cardiorespiratory fitness, my balance, my strength, my coordination. And some of these interventions, or some of these ways of talking about physical activity in the literature, talk about activity that's done for a purpose or kind of an intent. And to kind of make this a little more concrete, some examples of this include leisure time physical activity. So rather than focusing on exercise, this is more of activity that I do for fun that requires movement. So things like going for a hike or taking a yoga class, or going for a bike ride or a swim or a walk with my family. There are some other types of physical activity that are sometimes talked about in the research as well. These include daily physical activity. So when I think about the activity that I do kind of just through the course of living my day, some of these activities require me to be physically active. I take my dog for a walk every morning. I clean my house. I do some yard work. I rake leaves or shovel snow. Those are daily physical activities that I need to do that I don't think, oh, now I'm going to go do my exercise, but I think, well, I need to do this chore, and it just happens to require physical activity. One of the other kind of common ways that I see physical activity talked about in some of the research is habitual physical activity. And this kind of combines all of these types of activity to talk about my normal routine amount of energy expenditure throughout the day. So over the course of my day-to-day life, kind of almost without even thinking about it, how much physical activity am I doing combined? Sedentary behavior itself is a distinct type of physical inactivity. We know that the term sedentary behavior has been used by people, including clinicians, researchers, just kind of the general population as we've started to hear more about sedentary behavior in just out in public in general. But it's been defined in several different ways, and we all tend to use the term a little bit differently. And because of that, the Sedentary Behavior Research Network recently developed a consensus statement in 2017 to help bring us together in how we're defining sedentary behavior. And they define sedentary behavior using 3 components. They say, in order for an activity to be considered sedentary, we must be awake, in a seated or reclined position, and the activity that we're doing must require less than or equal to 1.5 times the resting metabolic energy expenditure. So that means a very low level of activity. So sedentary behaviors are often activities that, in my case, require a screen, whether I'm working at a computer or watching television or on my phone. They may be activities that we don't think of as particularly sedentary because they are part of our daily routine. If you're traveling somewhere or commuting to work, you're spending a lot of time maybe awake in your car, which is a seated position. There are even some hobbies that require a lot of sedentary time. I play the piano. I do that while I'm sitting, and it doesn't usually require a whole lot of energy. Sometimes even craft activities or board games, table games, things like that might be classified as sedentary behavior. Reducing sedentary behavior after stroke has pretty recently gained attention among rehab scientists and clinicians as being an important outcome that's unaddressed or that's not addressed by our existing physical activity or rehab interventions. So I want to dig a little bit more into specifically why is reducing sedentary behavior important after stroke. Sedentary behavior is associated with a range of biomarkers that impact common chronic comorbid health conditions. These include things like cardiovascular or heart disease risk, waist circumference measurements or body mass index, triglycerides, insulin or glucose control, C-reactive protein levels, which is a marker of inflammation in the body, high blood pressure, and depressive symptoms. These these biomarkers are associated with chronic conditions that are often found to be comorbid with stroke. There was a recent study that was published in Canada just this year that demonstrated that 81% of stroke survivors have at least one of these chronic conditions listed here on the right in the yellow box. These include heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, depression, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, or COPD. And so because of this, reducing sedentary behavior is particularly important after stroke. We know that people with stroke encounter a lot of barriers to physical activity. A systematic review of barriers specifically focusing on that MVPA or exercise adherence and habitual physical activity identified that these barriers come from impairments in body functions, accessibility challenges, and sometimes social support. So when we're talking about body function, we're talking about residual impairments that I mentioned earlier, motor function, cognition, and mood. When we talk about access, in general, talking about access to community centers or fitness facilities, but there are a number of barriers specifically to that. We know that transportation is sometimes a problem, often a problem, and particularly in rural areas. The costs associated with community fitness centers or fitness facilities can be barriers. And then once you get there and are able to afford access to these facilities, sometimes the accessibility of the environment itself, can you get into the building? Is the equipment set up for people who may have balance problems or have trouble using one side of their body equally as the other side of their body? So we know that there are a lot of access barriers that are outside of the individual. We also know that limitations in social support for supporting this access can be a challenge. We also know that social support can be a motivator for physical activity. But the way that we can leverage that social support and help use that social support most effectively to improve physical activity after stroke is still something that we're investigating. So let's say that we overcome all of those barriers to exercise and MVPA and habitual low levels of physical activity. Even if people with stroke overcome these barriers, they can still accumulate a high level of sedentary behavior throughout the day. Let's say, for example, that my friend, Mrs. Larson, does 30 minutes of exercise each day, which is right in line with the guidelines for physical activity. Maybe she sleeps for 7 hours at night. This leaves 16 and a half hours during her day, during which the activities that she engages in can still influence her life. And this is when we're most likely to see that sedentary behavior. Further, those patterns in which sedentary time is accumulated can affect health. And we refer to these patterns as being fragmented or prolonged sitting. So let's say, for example, that you and I each spend 3 hours working at our desk in the morning. I spend the whole time in my comfy desk chair sitting without getting up. But you make sure to stand up every 30 to 60 minutes to go refill your coffee, or maybe your doorbell rings, or your dog needs to go out, or you want to go take a short walk. Your sedentary behavior is considered more fragmented than mine. And because of that, you are more likely to have better health outcomes than I am. Before the pandemic hit, healthy adults in the United States spent anywhere between, on average, 5.5 to 6.5 hours each day in sedentary behavior. People with stroke spend more time sedentary than healthy adults. And we know that this begins during hospitalization. One study that was published recently demonstrated that people with stroke spend 87% of their waking hours sedentary during rehab. This same study also looked at the amount of time that's spent sedentary during therapy sessions. So these are the times when we would expect people with stroke to be the least sedentary, when they're doing physical or occupational therapy. And this study identified that more than half of the time in these therapy sessions was spent sedentary. There are 2 additional studies that have been published that looked at that transition from the hospital to home. And they learned that simply going home to that new and familiar, but to a different environment, was associated with a reduction in sedentary time by 45 to 47 minutes per day, and also with an improved step count by 600 to 700 steps per day. So we know that just going home can improve physical activity a little bit, but it's still not quite enough. High levels of sedentary behavior persist into and throughout chronic stroke. Several studies have used activity monitors to determine that people with stroke are spending anywhere between 9 to 11 of their waking hours sedentary each day, which translates to about 60 to 80% of their waking time. And that's quite significantly greater than the 6.5 hours reported in healthy adults. There have also been several longitudinal studies that measured sedentary behavior at several time points after stroke and demonstrated that these high levels of sedentary behavior remain elevated over the first 1 to 4 years after stroke. And we don't know what happens after 4 years. When the studies stopped measuring, but we suspect that it probably stays elevated at that level. So to better understand potential barriers to non-sedentary activities, we started to look at some clinical factors that are related to post-stroke sedentary behavior. So my team used data from 42 people with chronic stroke who wore an activity monitor for 7 days. And we identified that both physical function, so mobility, and cognitive function or thinking skills were both associated with total sedentary time and sedentary behavior fragmentation. And these findings are consistent with a recent review that suggested that physical function and cognitive function both might influence sedentary behavior. So we might then kind of sit back and say to ourselves, if physical function and cognitive function are associated with non-sedentary time, that if we can see an improvement in these areas, that might lead us to assume that people are more independent with their meaningful activities and that they might then become less sedentary. But unfortunately, this isn't the case. There was a study published in 2017 of what the authors of the study termed physically recovered stroke survivors. And the study suggested that cognitive impairments, depressive symptoms, and independence in social and community activities, or dependence in social and community activities persisted, despite what the medical field frequently characterizes as a good physically recovered recovery. So to begin to address some of these gaps that we were seeing in the literature and in our experience working with people with stroke, as part of my dissertation, I had a team that conducted a systematic review to look at what interventions are out there that might help to reduce sedentary behavior or to improve the frequency of daily physical activities after stroke. Since we suspected that by improving the frequency or the amount of daily physical activity, that we might be able to disrupt or reduce sedentary behavior. We identified 31 studies that addressed these 2 outcomes. And we noticed that very few of these studies, let me get my pointer here. Here we go. That very few of these studies actually addressed daily physical activity or sedentary behavior as their main goal. So most of the interventions that we found were intending to improve something else, and they just happened to measure physical activity or sedentary behavior as a potential secondary outcome of the intervention. We also learned that these interventions included a wide range and many different combinations of education, exercise, and behavior change counseling or therapies, and that the effects of these interventions ranged from no effects to hopeful, maybe large effects. So we found that even though we weren't able to say which interventions were the most promising, we learned that existing interventions that aimed to influence daily physical activity levels were complex, meaning they had multiple components, multiple approaches that they were blending together to try to influence physical activity. And they were very rarely well described in the literature. We also identified only 2 existing interventions that specifically aimed to reduce sedentary behavior after stroke. And these interventions are in very early phases of intervention development. So as I move into discussing the intervention that we developed, kind of growing or building on what we found in our systematic review, I want to pause for just a moment and comment on this behavioral intervention development process. Methods for this really early phase of what we call complex behavioral intervention development emphasize the importance of investing a lot of time really early on in the process that will lead us to the simplest possible theoretically grounded intervention. And the simplest possible because we want to eventually be able to implement this in a widespread way. And in order to do that, we want to keep it as simple as possible to make it easy to learn and to require as few resources as needed to have the best outcome that we can. And theoretically grounded so that we are making sure that we're understanding how and why this intervention may or may not work. That will help us to understand more how to refine the intervention in the future. So we follow the Medical Research Council guidelines, which is a group out of the United Kingdom that recommends that these early stages include a theoretical development process where we specifically define the active ingredients, the things that we think cause or support the change, and structural elements, how we're going to package the intervention, how often, how much of the intervention is required, where the intervention will be delivered, and who will be delivering the intervention. We then move into an intervention specification process where we begin to try the intervention with people who are willing to try it with us. And we designed this portion of the study in a way that lets us refine the research protocol and develop our manual to guide the intervention in the future so that other people can eventually learn how to deliver the intervention. And then we pilot test the intervention, which allows us to assess the intervention feasibility. And I'll talk a little bit more about specifically what I mean by feasibility in a minute, and to start to estimate the effects of the intervention on sedentary behavior, on our clinical outcome. So we initiated the development of ABLE, the Activating Behavior for Lasting Engagement intervention, following these steps. I'm going to refer to it as ABLE throughout the remainder of this talk. We use a theoretical grounding called behavioral activation to define our active ingredients and structural elements. After we defined what we thought this intervention might look like, we used a descriptive case series design that allowed us to refine the ABLE protocol based on participant and therapist feedback. And then once this protocol was refined, we piloted the intervention to assess the feasibility of ABLE and estimate the effects of ABLE on sedentary behavior. The ABLE intervention is grounded in an assumption that engaging in meaningful daily activities requires movement out of a seated position to an upright position, disrupting sedentary time. We also presume that these meaningful activities are likely more motivating than exercise or step count goals, which have frequently been the outcomes of interest in prior interventions. And we think this is because those meaningful activities are uniquely motivating to the person who chooses to engage in them. And so our working hypothesis is that promoting participation in those meaningful daily activities distributed throughout the day may reduce sedentary behavior after stroke. Behavioral activation was selected as a promising theoretical grounding for promoting frequent engagement in daily activities. This behavioral activation approach was initially designed to teach people skills for engagement in pleasurable activities for the purpose of reducing depressive symptoms among adults with major depressive disorder. Activity scheduling and activity monitoring are hallmarks of behavioral activation. We anticipated that using these two ingredients to address full day activity patterns, and then combined with skills training in problem solving and self-assessment to empower people with stroke to identify their own challenges and select their own solutions to the activities that they want to engage in, could lead to frequent engagement in meaningful activities that reduces sitting throughout the day. So these four active ingredients of behavioral activation provide participants with an explicit approach for participating in meaningful activities frequently throughout the day. So after monitoring their activities and sitting time, participants select a meaningful activity that they wish to engage in and schedule that activity during a time when they might typically spend sitting. They work with the therapist in a collaborative manner to identify any challenges or safety concerns, and then to identify potential solutions. And when I talk about collaborative problem solving, specifically, our therapists are trained not to tell, or it's specifically trained to not tell the participant what to do, but instead to ask guided questions in a way that draws the problem, the potential challenges, and then draws the potential solutions from the participant, rather than imposing our own ideas on what might work best in their context. So participants using this collaborative problem solving approach might decide to adapt an activity that they wish to do to overcome physical limitations, or to identify strategies for remembering to add a movement break during an activity that involves prolonged sitting. I had several people in some of the studies that I'll be talking about in a minute who were really big readers, and that was their meaningful activity. Or they really enjoyed playing bridge, which is a card game where you sit for a long time. And so rather than saying, don't do those activities, we strategized ways that people could remember to take a break from sitting to stand up for a minute or so during those activities that they found meaningful. So then after the participants have the opportunity to attempt the plan, they work through a self-assessment process to identify positive and negative outcomes of building that activity into their day. We also specified the structural elements of the ABLE intervention. So this intervention was delivered in 12 sessions over a 4-week period of time in participants' homes, so they never had to travel anywhere. An occupational therapist delivered that intervention. And we developed the ICANN planning process, which provides a step-by-step structure that walks the participants through scheduling, monitoring, self-assessing, and problem solving. We used the activity card sort to generate ideas for activities to participate in during sitting times. And this is a tool that's really common in the occupational therapy world. It's a deck of cards that have pictures of a wide array of potentially meaningful daily activities, common activities that a lot of people may participate in. And so we used that to, in a manner that allowed participants to kind of think through, what are the activities that I've given up or that I'm doing less of since my stroke? And we asked them then to select activities that that might be reasonable to think about doing again, or to try doing again during our sessions together. We also have flexibility in our brainstorming process that if there are activities that are not included in the card sort that are meaningful to them, those are welcome as part of the discussion and part of the planning process as well. Participants tracked each step of ABLE in a paper and pencil workbook, which had the ICANN plan worksheets in it that we provided. So moving into the specification phase of developing the ABLE intervention, we used a descriptive case series to refine the ABLE intervention. We explored feasibility markers to inform how we might refine and update the intervention process. And we defined feasibility as tolerability, safety, reliable intervention delivery, and satisfaction. We defined tolerability, or we measured tolerability by session attendance, and we monitored safety by keeping track of any adverse events such as a fall or an injury that might be associated with the study. We measured reliable intervention delivery using a fidelity checklist that we developed to identify the presence or absence of those 4 key components in the intervention sessions. And so one of our research assistants watched video of a portion. In this phase, she watched video of every intervention session and completed a checklist for each session to see that we were including activity scheduling, activity monitoring, self-assessment, and problem solving consistently throughout the intervention. We measured participant satisfaction at the end of intervention using a questionnaire called the Client Satisfaction Questionnaire 8. And we described participant demographic characteristics and clinical characteristics related to their stroke at pre-intervention. Finally, we measured sedentary behavior at pre and post-intervention using the ActivPAL Micro 3. Even though this was not the primary focus of the intervention specification stage, we wanted to measure sedentary behavior to begin to have some experience with measuring sedentary behavior using the ActivPAL, and also to begin to explore trends or patterns of change that might be associated with ABLE. The ActivPAL Micro 3 is just a small device. It's about 3/4 of an inch tall, maybe a half an inch wide, and it's waterproofed and adhered to the front of the participant's thigh. Our participants wore the ActivPAL for 7 days, and during that time, they documented the time that they woke up and the time that they went to bed, any napping time, and any non-wear time on a diary. When we received the monitor back from the participant, we removed sleep and non-wear time, because remember, sleep is not considered sedentary. And the monitor gives us data that are coded by posture. So it tells us how much time people spend in a seated or reclined position, how much time they spend standing, how much time they spend stepping, and it also gives us a step count. And we use these data to calculate the mean daily time spent in prolonged sitting. People with chronic stroke who reported greater than or equal to 6 hours of daily sitting time were included in this phase of the study. Excuse me. Our participants ranged in age from 51 to 73 years, and 4 were male. Our participants had a variety of caregiver and residential situations that ranged from living alone without a caregiver to living in an assisted living facility with full-time caregiving support. 4 of our participants reported to us that their physical activity level was low relative to their pre-stroke physical activity levels, and 1 participant felt that his physical activity level was the same. Our first participant, of course, received the very first version of ABLE, and this version included a time spent asking the participant to report the daily schedule and to identify times when he might spend sitting during the day, and then completing the activity card sort, all in session 1. Sessions 2 through 12 included an iterative process of monitoring activity, self-assessment, problem solving, and scheduling new activities. Feedback from this participant and my own observations as the treating therapist led us to revise ABLE for the next participants. And we did this by adding a little bit more structure to sessions 1 and 2, including a more in-depth discussion about sedentary behavior. And then, instead of asking the participant to report their activity patterns from memory, we instructed them to monitor their activity for 1 day between sessions 1 and 2 using a worksheet that we provided. And this came about because with the first participant, we kind of hit a point where he felt like he was active and he didn't really he felt like he was already breaking up his sedentary behavior. And I didn't know if he was or if he wasn't. And so we decided that a good step at that point would be for him to just monitor his activity for a day and see how often he was getting up. And when I left his house that day, he said, "Oh, I get up every 30 minutes, no problem." And when I came back 2 days later and he had monitored his activity, he said, "That was harder than I thought. I thought for sure I got up more than once an hour, but I don't." And then he was ready to get down to work and find some activities that would help him to break up his sedentary time and be more active throughout the day. And so because of that, we decided to move that activity monitoring, that very first one, to actually have them monitor their activity. It made it a little bit more salient in their mind. So then when we came to the second session, that's when we completed the activity card sort and continued sessions 3 through 12 using the iterative process of activity monitoring, self-assessment, problem solving, and activity scheduling. We looked at feasibility outcomes with these 5 participants, and all of our participants met the benchmark for tolerability and for safety. 3 of the 5 participants met the benchmark for acceptability and reliability. So we took a closer look at the intervention process and participant characteristics for the 2 participants who did not meet these criteria. And we identified that the very first version of ABLE, even though it included all of the components, it was much more loosely structured at the beginning than the revised version. And we suspect that this likely influenced the participant satisfaction and the fidelity or the reliability of the intervention delivery with that participant. We also identified that participant number 4 reported a very high level of sedentary behavior when we screened him for the study, but in reality had a very low level of sedentary behavior when he wore the ActivPAL monitor. And so we suspect that maybe his low satisfaction and the low reliability of the intervention delivery may stem from a low need for this particular intervention. Although the purpose of this study, remember, was to inform how we improved the ABLE intervention process, we also looked at individual results from the ActivPAL monitors. We noticed varied responses among our participants. 2 of our participants started off with a very low level of prolonged sitting, despite having reported high amounts of sitting time at study screening. These participants felt like they were very inactive, even though in our study they were some of our most active participants. And these 2 participants showed no response to treatment, likely related to a floor effect. We don't expect anyone to eliminate all sitting from their day. That's an unreasonable ask, and that's not recommended. It's not necessary. 2 participants showed small and moderate reductions in the percentage of their waking hours spent in prolonged sitting. Both of these participants had impairments in mobility and in arm or upper extremity function. However, 1 participant lived alone and 1 participant lived with a caregiver who was very highly concerned about falls and reminded him about it very frequently. So we suspect that the social environment may have played a role in these participants' responses to the ABLE intervention. Finally, 1 participant demonstrated a very slight to no response to treatment. This participant also had impairments in mobility and upper extremity function, and this participant resided in an assisted living facility. Although this participant was, quote unquote, allowed to move independently in his room, the environment and the very low demand for his involvement in any daily activities beyond his basic self-cares may have played a role in how he responded to the ABLE intervention. So we needed to explore these effects further, and we wanted to continue to examine the feasibility of ABLE. And so once we had what we felt like was a well-described, specified, and manualized intervention, we explored the feasibility of ABLE and assessed change on sedentary behavior outcomes using a single group delayed baseline research. I'll walk you through kind of week by week what we did. At baseline part 1, we assessed sedentary behavior using the ActivPAL monitor, and we also assessed baseline descriptive characteristics, so demographics and effects of the stroke as far as impairments and social environment at that time. We then completed a dose-matched, no intervention delay during weeks 2 through 5. So this was the same amount of time that the intervention was delivered in, but during this time, the participants didn't have any interaction with the research team. We visited our participants again at week 6, and they wore the activity monitor for another 7 days. And then after that, they participated in 12 ABLE intervention sessions during weeks 7 through 10. Sedentary behavior was assessed again during week 11 and a follow-up 8 weeks later at week 18. This study included 21 community dwelling people with chronic stroke who reported greater than or equal to 6 hours of sitting time on a typical weekday. Our inclusion and exclusion criteria were the same as in the descriptive case series, the prior study. All of our participants completed baseline 1 and the no intervention delay. And unfortunately, I had to withdraw one participant during baseline part 2 after her dog ate 2 of our somewhat expensive activity monitors. All of our remaining participants completed the entire intervention process and post-intervention procedures. 2 participants had missing activity monitoring data at follow-up, but they did complete the questionnaire-based measures. The ABLE intervention was delivered in this study by 2 occupational therapists, following the protocol that we previously established and keeping the active ingredients and the structure of the intervention the same. We assessed change over time, again, using the ActivPAL Micro 3. And after we received the activity monitor and the diary back from the person, we removed sleep time and used these data to calculate 2 variables this time, the mean daily time spent in prolonged sitting and the mean daily number of sit to stand transitions. Participants in this sample were on average 70 years of age, and most of our participants were female. Most of our participants also reported that their current activity level was low relative to their pre-stroke physical activity level, which is what we expected to see. We examined our feasibility outcomes against benchmarks that we had established before we started the study. In this sample, our benchmarks for tolerability, reliable intervention delivery, and safety were met. And the benchmark for participant satisfaction was borderline, but not quite met. We detected a moderate to large effect of ABLE on prolonged sitting time at post-intervention. And this translated into a mean group reduction of 55 minutes per day. Unfortunately, these effects were not maintained. At post-intervention, we detected a small reduction on prolonged sitting of 19 minutes per day. The effects of ABLE on the mean daily number of sit to stand transitions were really quite small at post-intervention and negligible at follow-up. The ABLE intervention is intended to reduce sedentary behavior through participating in meaningful daily activities. And it requires further pilot testing to inform our ongoing intervention development. In this study, we demonstrated that ABLE is tolerable, can be reliably delivered, and is safe. Our benchmark for participant satisfaction was not quite met, and we think that identifying indicators for sedentary behavior interventions that would tell us that somebody might benefit from a sedentary behavior intervention may enhance that participant satisfaction. We also demonstrated moderate to large effects at post-intervention that were diminished at follow-up. Our post-intervention effects were larger than the other existing intervention that's been piloted in chronic stroke. However, we must further explore intervention components that might promote that sustained intervention effect. And we think that this is largely due to factors outside of the individual, like the social environment, that may influence physical activity levels and help us, if we can identify how to best use that social environment to support physical activity, that might help us to sustain intervention effects. It's important to remember that the purpose of this pilot study was to begin to explore change that may be associated with ABLE, but that the effects that we identified are not definitive. The single group study design only allows us to describe change over time on sedentary behavior outcomes. So the next phase of development that will lead to an efficacy trial is currently in the works. I actually just submitted a grant proposal to adapt ABLE to a telerehabilitation model and to then conduct the first pilot randomized trial of this intervention that will tell us more about those effects. After this further pilot testing, the goal is that an efficacy study would allow us to confirm intervention effects, and that this would then lead to implementation trials to explore the effectiveness of ABLE embedded in routine clinical practice. Although the ABLE intervention is not quite ready for full-scale implementation, these findings can inform how we think about daily activities and routines to address health promotion. And I think this is particularly relevant in 3 areas. Although we know that people with stroke have high levels of sedentary behavior, our clients may have different times during their day when their activities are or are not sedentary. It can be quite variable. So seeking to understand those individual patterns may help to identify times when your client might be at particularly high risk for prolonged sitting, and then to kind of focus in on those times to identify ways to break up prolonged sitting using activities that they find particularly meaningful or enjoyable. I think it's also important to remember that sedentary behavior exists within a finite 24-hour time period. So if we change the amount of time that's spent in sedentary behavior, it may also influence the amount of time spent sleeping or the amount of time spent doing other physical activity. And we also know that qualitatively, sedentary behavior can influence how well someone sleeps or how much physical activity they may have, and vice versa. So as you think about sedentary behavior, it's important to also think about how changing sedentary behavior or changing another type of sleep or physical activity behavior influences other behaviors within that 24-hour day. We also need to recognize that meaningful activities can be sedentary or non-sedentary, and we are by no means asking people to stop doing the activities that they prefer, but instead to modify them, which is definitely easier said than done. Within the ABLE studies, we didn't restrict activities to non-sedentary participation. We know that people are likely to sustain engagement in activities that they enjoy doing. So if participants selected an active activity or a non-sedentary activity, the therapist problem solved with them to identify ways to do more of that activity throughout the day or to distribute that activity a little bit more throughout the day. But if the participant selected a sedentary activity, the therapist problem solved strategies to break up that sitting time. In addition, when participation in meaningful activities is assessed in rehab settings or as an outcome, the measures that are informative don't necessarily distinguish between sedentary and non-sedentary activities, nor do they assess the day-to-day variability in participation. And I think that this is likely because the way that people do activities can vary between individuals. So for example, if I told you that I spend 8 to 10 hours a day at my computer working, you might assume that I'm sitting the whole time. But Carly and I were just talking about sit to stand desks before the talk here. I have a sit to stand desk and I try to remember to stand at least a little bit every hour. So if someone was asking me about my daily activities and they stopped at, oh, you spend 8 to 10 hours a day at your desk working, they might not move to that understanding of how that might actually be affecting my health and where might be an opportunity to try to be more active or not. So when talking with people about their physical activity or sedentary behavior and their meaningful activities, it's really important to ask about those additional details of their preferred activities. Second, I mentioned the social environment several times throughout this talk. Existing interventions that aim to influence sedentary behavior, including ABLE, really focus in on the individual's behavior. We know that the social environment, the other people in my environment, are associated with physical activity levels among healthy community dwelling adults and at-risk older adults. After stroke, we also know that people depend on the people within their social environment for support and assistance with daily and instrumental activities. And it's likely that this environment can influence sedentary behavior. So as another part of the grant that I recently submitted, I'm beginning to examine the role of those interpersonal social influences to help understand how we can use social elements of interventions in a positive way that maybe helps to sustain reduced sedentary behavior and promote health after stroke. Third, reducing sedentary behavior using meaningful daily activities is only the short-term goal of interventions such as ABLE. And as we continue to build on this work, we will also explore the influence of these interventions on long-term health outcomes like blood glucose and insulin control, hypertension, and recurrent stroke. And this is a really hot topic actually at the National Institutes of Health right now. I've been attending a conference yesterday, today, and tomorrow where they're really focusing in on physical activity and disability, and have learned through a thorough literature review that many of the prevention and health promotion intervention studies so far have failed to include people with stroke-related disability. And the disability studies that focus on physical activity and sedentary behavior don't measure these important health outcomes that we see as a longer term goal. And so this is an area that we're very interested in moving this research into. So once we've further refined the ABLE intervention, our goal is to include measures of these health outcomes in addition to longer follow-up periods that will allow us to assess these long-term goals of physical activity. Before I take questions or discussion, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the numerous people who have been involved in and supported this work, specifically some of my mentors at the University of Pittsburgh and here at the University of Illinois at Chicago, my funding sources that have paid for some of the research that I described and some of my training, the 3 research programs that I've been involved in, and a really special thank you to the research participants who engaged with me in the ABLE and the MABLE studies, who are central to making sure that this research happens. Research like this can't happen without people who are willing to give something new a try with us. And so I really value the research participants who engaged with me in these studies. And so with that, I am excited to take any questions or discussion or comments that you might have.
When you're talking about monitoring activity, my kids this weekend gave me our Christmas present early, and it's an Apple Watch. And so, you know, I'm a rookie at setting it up. So the first day I put it on mid-afternoon, and there's activity section on it. And it's, you know, for standing, I said, yeah, probably about 6 hours a day I stand at least. So at 3 in the morning, it rang to say that I needed to stand. I hadn't stood enough.
Oh no.
So I'm sure it's because I hadn't had it on for 24 hours yet. But so anyhow, I've taken off all the activity alarms.
Yeah.
I Yeah, and that kind of brings me to my question. I was going to ask if you had recommendations on monitors, or do you think that that really helps increase, or do you think, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's a review that was published pretty recently that looked specifically at studies that use the activity monitor itself as the intervention. And there's, like, at this point, there's pretty limited evidence to say that that's largely effective or not effective. The studies weren't necessarily very rigorously designed. There were some weaknesses that limited their ability to draw firm conclusions.
Okay.
But that said, becoming aware is often the first step. And so using an activity monitor to become aware and talking about it with somebody, or setting a goal. So for example, I am a little bit of a hypocrite. I used to wear a Fitbit and I don't, because I learned that I sit for the entire hour at 10 o'clock every day. I just don't get up during that time. And instead of changing my behavior, I just decided to quit wearing the activity monitor. But if I had maybe talked with someone about it and said, hey, 10 o'clock every day, what can I do to remember to get up? Maybe I make that my time that I go get a coffee, or maybe I decide the dog needs to go for a walk during that time now that I'm home. So finding a way to, like, take that information and use it to improve your activity level, and bringing someone in with you to be accountable to may help that activity monitoring. I think that it's better than nothing.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So the participant brought someone with them usually, or when you guys had your trial, your pilot?
Yeah, it really varied depending on the participant. One of the things that we made sure to do during these discussions was talk about safety. Since in many cases our participants were doing these activities, or they were meeting with us on a Monday and a Wednesday and a Friday, perhaps that week. And so on Monday, we would talk about what they were planning to do tomorrow and breaking up their activity on Tuesday. And so if the activities that they chose were something of a safety risk, had some element of a safety risk, we made sure that they had a plan for that. And that often included a support person or a caregiver.
Sure.
Being present, or giving them a reminder, or checking on them. Like, I had one participant that said, well, I'm going to go swimming, and I'm going to go swimming at, his wife was like the high school, I don't know, superintendent or something. Principals they had access to the local swimming pool, and he was going to go after hours when there wasn't a lifeguard. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm gonna be responsible for this. Yeah. So as the treating therapist, I said, well, let's talk about this a little bit more, and directly address that safety head on. I think one of the things that we find in this work, and also one of my mentors is Dr. Elizabeth Skidmore, who does a lot of research around strategy training and guided discovery, which is that idea that we're not telling people what to do. We are skillfully asking questions that elicit what the participant or the stroke survivor wants to do. And safety is one of the questions that we get all the time. She gets it all the time. With this work, we obviously get it quite a bit. And one of the things that we learn is that people with stroke, for the most part, really know their own ability and their limitations, and they know what they need to do to be safe. And so we make sure that is explicitly stated and explicitly discussed. And we've seen people do things that they didn't think they would ever do again, safely, with those direct conversations. Yes, it does often involve social support or a caregiver.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Good. Yeah, I'm excited for you to hear about your tele-rehab model, because I think that's so important right now, especially with COVID and just in general. We have always been promoting tele-rehab even prior to COVID, but now it's even more so. So I hope you get funded and get to chat.
Yeah. definitely. I'm starting a small pilot, kind of another case series. I'm just submitting the IRB for it this week here in Chicago.
Okay.
But I think another advantage, you probably could tell me better than I can, is my heart is for rural rehab. And I know that we do all these studies in metro areas, and they don't necessarily get out to rural areas. And so to eventually be able to better understand some of the unique needs of rural areas and what would support a tele-rehab model or other models of rehab in rural areas.
Right. Yeah, technology access is probably the biggest barrier we are aware of anyways. We're working on a needs assessment survey right now and hopefully kind of trying to gauge some of that. A lot of providers in North Dakota have gotten access to dollars to give out iPads and things, but then there also needs to be a component of teaching someone how to use it. Like Sandy brought up the example of getting the watch, but you have to know how to, how to use
Like,
it.
how do you make sure it doesn't tell you at 3 a.m. that you should stand up? Right?
Exactly. Yeah. So that becomes another barrier to teaching you using your technology that you're given. So
Yeah. I'm analyzing some data right now. I'm involved in another study, a collaboration with Dr. Skidmore at Pittsburgh, and then it's a multi-site study in St. Louis and here in Chicago, where we had a social learning intervention that had been meeting in person, and then COVID hit. And instead of just dropping the study, they said the social participation is really important. And so we're going to transfer it to Zoom and see what happens. And I was able to interview the participants in the study and the staff and the therapists and the peer facilitators to understand what that whole process looked like. And so hopefully we'll have, and as part of that, we talked, or we looked for like what were the hard parts about learning Zoom on this new device, and like what sorts of training do you think might have helped? And we have some really, I think, interesting findings soon.
Good. Okay. Yeah.
It's just one small study, but it's starting to get in that direction.
Yeah. So I know the idea is just to increase overall, but is there like a goal of like, how they say 10,000 steps, or, if someone is using a monitor, or is that, are you just trying to just increase anything at all?
Yeah, that's a really good question. What's that?
Like an ideal number or ideal amount of time you'd like to see, or anything?
Yeah, so it's easier to tell like what to do than what not to do, right? Which is why we have step count goals. I actually used to refer to 10,000 steps and was made aware by a mentor that 10,000 is the controversial research study. 7,500 is acceptable.
Okay.
But I mean, 10,000 is obviously better, but 7,500 is good.
Okay.
But when it comes to sedentary behavior, the field that's looking at that has had a really difficult time identifying what's like the threshold of too much. The World Health Organization actually released new physical activity and sedentary behavior guidelines last week. They had their webinar on Thanksgiving Day.
Really?
And I was just looking in their, I didn't attend on Thanksgiving, but I was reading in their report that they released that there's not sufficient evidence at this point to say how much sedentary behavior is too much. But there is evidence to say less is better.
Sure.
More fragmented is better.
Okay.
So stay tuned, I guess I would say.
Yes.
And I think even just as individuals, even, if like say there was a number and I had much more sedentary behavior than that, like I'm not gonna jump all the way down to that number right now. So even just setting a short-term goal, maybe this week I'm gonna try to stand up at least once every hour. And then next week I'm gonna try to stand up once every 45 minutes. and I'm going to keep trying to reduce my sedentary behavior that way. Or maybe I'm going to think about it from a minute standpoint. And today I'm going to try to spend 30, instead of watching that one TV show that I don't even care if I watch, I'm going to go for a walk during that time. So even just making those small incremental changes will eventually likely lead to improved health.
Good. And my yoga lady I listen to on YouTube or watch it on YouTube, she talks about 21 days to create a habit.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's an important thing that people need to remember too, is that it takes quite a while to kind of start a habit. Usually we're trying to get rid of habits, but if we want to start a good one, it takes 21 days to kind of adjust.
Yeah.
What she says anyway. I don't know if there's scientific research behind that, but
That sounds about right.
okay.
Yeah. Remembering that it's, a little bit different for everyone, but on average.
Sure.
On average, that sounds about right. Yeah. And it's an intentional 21 days, right? It's not
Yes.
happen.
Yes,
I think that's the hardest part.
And then you'll hopefully start to just crave it and want to do it, and create that habit. So yeah, good. Anybody else have anything for Emily? You're so quiet. Okay, well, thank you so much, Emily, for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining me.
Yes.
For having me.
Yes, of course, definitely. We look forward to hearing more about what comes out of your study and stuff. I think it's exciting. So,
Absolutely.
all right. You have a good rest of the day, and we'll talk to you later.
Thank you so much. You too.